This is a talk about what feminism is not. Feminism is not progressive. Feminism is not egalitarian. Feminism is not liberal. Feminism is not left-wing. In fact, feminism is pretty much the antithesis of all of those four things. In the first part, I'm going to discuss some aspects of contemporary feminism and explain how I understand feminism based on feminist behavior, feminist policies, and observable facts about feminist activism. But I'm going to begin first with some definitions that are given in dictionaries of feminism. So let's begin with those. Feminism, the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. That's from Merriam-Webster. Feminism, organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. That's Merriam-Webster too. Feminism, the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes. That's from Oxford Languages. Feminism is a range of social movements, political movements, and ideologies that aim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes. That's from Wikipedia. Each one of those makes some kind of insinuation that feminism is in favor of equality. Feminism is most definitely not in favor of equality. Feminism is one of the most profoundly dangerous anti-egalitarian movements in the world. So I reject these definitions. These definitions are untrue. They do not reflect the actual beliefs and actions and practices of contemporary feminism. So instead, I'll explain the underlying feminist ideology as I understand it as follows, and that's essentially my definition of contemporary feminism. Feminism is a form of identity politics based on sex. There are several forms, in fact, of contemporary identity politics, and the two primary ones are based on sex, or they're based on race. There are a number of other forms of identity politics which turn out to be in competition in some ways, or sometimes complement, but are frequently in competition with each other. But feminism is one of the dominant forms of identity politics. And this particular form is based on sex. Feminism has two core claims, but there are similar core claims for the other forms of identity politics. Each of them has an oppression narrative, and each of them has a social justice policy. And you simply modify those as is relevant for the particular form of, to get the particular form of identity politics in question. In relation to feminism, the oppression narrative runs as follows. There exists a patriarchy under which women are an oppressed group, perhaps due to sexism or male violence or toxic masculinity or male privilege, etc. And men are an oppressor group. So that is the oppression narrative. One could give a similar oppression narrative in relation to race and in relation to sexuality, and no doubt many other things as well. The social justice policy says, moreover, activism and policies, whether they be governmental or institutional, must be directed at the aim of dismantling the patriarchal system of oppression. And the outcome of that, fulfilling that aim, will then be social justice. Social justice is defined to be the outcome of fulfilling the aim of dismantling the relevant system of oppression, and in this case, the alleged system of oppression, whose existence I'm going to go on to deny. The relevant social justice is the outcome of dismantling the relevant system of oppression, in this case, the patriarchal system of oppression. that definition that I just given in terms of the oppression narrative and in terms of the social justice policy is one that would be accepted by virtually all the feminists that I discuss below or list below, who are involved in various forms of activism in relation to the educational system or legal system or elsewhere. That definition of feminism in terms of the patriarchal system of oppression and the social policy aim of dismantling the patriarchal system of oppression would be accepted by virtually all of those. And furthermore, that definition is one that would also be accepted by pretty much any opponents of feminism that I'm inclined to discuss in this talk. There may be a few other opponents of feminism who have very little understanding of feminism, who have not directly interacted with feminists or read feminist literature. They are not particularly relevant, but certainly the patriarchy theory definition combined with social justice measures definition would also be accepted by the opponents of feminism that I discuss in this talk. I do not define feminism as a belief in gender equality. And this is for a number of reasons. I could list more reasons than these two, but these are two important ones. The first one is that observably, feminists reject gender equality. Feminism is not a gender equality movement. Feminism is a gender anti-equality movement. Feminism is primarily opposed to gender equality. And the second reason is that that understanding that this is so is in fact widely understood by large segments of the population. So only a smallish proportion of the population describe themselves as feminists. These numbers will fluctuate depending on who one surveys and what the precise question is and what the range of questions are. Maybe 10, 15%, maybe 20%, but nonetheless, they're reasonably small proportions of the population as a whole. Remember that a certain proportion of the population might describe themselves as socialists in one radical form or another. And remember that 5% of the population is schizophrenic. So as soon as you get very small proportions of a population advocating a certain view, you realize that you're now down into the group of people who are quite literally bonkers. But a large majority of the population support gender equality. So what that shows is that feminism is not the same as gender equality, or certainly the vast majority of people do not understand feminism to be advocacy of gender equality. In fact, they can see with their own eyes, because they're not stupid, that feminism is extremely frequently and vocally opposed to gender equality. It's an anti-egalitarian movement. So my definition of feminism is based on observation, and if one does this, then one really has an obligation to state precisely who one has in mind. There has to be a sample of such individuals whose behavior and belief system is the one being described. So as examples of contemporary feminism, I mean essentially all known political, academic, legal, and activist feminists of the last 50 years. There are a couple of exceptions, perhaps, to this, where Camille Paglia, for example, but she is one tiny drop in an ocean as large as the Pacific Ocean. So here's a list that I've constructed of feminists belonging to that contemporary period, by which I mean from roughly 1970 onwards. The last 5 decades: Kate Millett, Carol Hanisch, Germaine Greer, Catherine McKinnon, Andrea Dworkin. Some of these, by the way, have passed on. Andrea Dworkin, for example. Susan Brown Miller, Mary Koss, Ellen Pence, Jessica Valenti, Amanda Marcotte, J.K. Rowling, Julie Bindel, Megan Murphy, Posey Parker, Jess Phillips, Harriet Harman, Stella Creasy, Hillary Clinton, Laurie Penny, Laura Bates. These are all feminists that people whose names people might recognize: Michelle Dover, Alison Saunders, Vera Baird, Sophie Walker, Jennifer Saw, Sally Haslanger, and Kate Mann. These three are from the academic philosophy profession, rather famous in one way or another. Karen Ingala-Smith, Keir Starmer, Justin Trudeau, Sadiq Khan, Joe Biden. So the last four are male feminists in prominent positions of political power. There's no direct correlation between being a feminist and one's genitals. Obviously, one may be a male feminist or a female feminist. There's no linkage between those two things. The feminists listed above tend to fall into two main groups: Radfems and Intersectionals. The Radfems include, for example, Julie Bindel, J.K. Rowling, Megan Murphy, Germaine Greer, Catherine McKinnon, Percy Parker, Vera Baird, Harriet Wistridge, and others. Harriet Wistridge is the partner of Julie Bindel. They are involved in various activism to release violent and abusive women who've murdered their partners and have them released from prison. Intersectionals include Kate Mann, Jess Phillips, Harriet Harman, Stella Creasy, Hillary Clinton, Laurie Penny, Michelle Dover, and many, many, many others. And that polarization between those two different groups within feminism, a kind of internecine squabble, exists, but it's not something I'm going to pay a great deal of attention to. You have an internecine squabble around second wave feminism, largely Radfems in today's terminology, and intersectional feminists. Much of the second wave is and was dominated by radical feminism, whose most visible contemporary representatives today are TERFs. TERF is an abbreviation for trans exclusionary radical feminist. And the word, the phrase, well, the acronym, in fact, TERF is applied to radical feminists because they're radical feminists and they admit to being radical feminists. And the phrase trans exclusionary is applied to them because they wish to exclude trans people from basic services and provisions and access to basic support in society. So they are trans exclusionary radical feminists. So, for example, they don't think that trans people should be allowed to go to the toilet. Exactly how trans people are meant to urinate or defecate if they're not allowed to go to a toilet is a rather peculiar consequence of this ideology, and they've never quite explained exactly what people who are trans should do in relation to going to the toilet. But TERFs appear to believe that if trans people go to the toilet, then they will rape everybody. And, well, this is really a mental illness, and it's just that simple. In any case, TERFs hate men and promote violence and abuse of men. And that tends to be rather different with intersectionals. Intersectionals don't so openly hate men. So articles that are written that you can read with the title "Why I Hate Men," male violence, and so on. These are TERFs. These are always TERFs. Feminist activists that witter on about male violence, while at the same time covering up and excusing female violence, female murder, throwing acid over people, killing them, stabbing them, killing them with a hammer, for example. If you want to locate some of that stuff, you can find it by Googling the names of some of the aforementioned TERFs. They hate men, they promote violence and abuse and killing of men. I'm not going to discuss rather tiresome conspiracy theories claiming that these folks are all postmodernists or that they're critical theorists. They're not critical theorists, they're not postmodernists. Catherine McKinnon is not a postmodernist or a critical theorist. Kirsten Gillibrand is not a postmodernist or a critical theorist. Jess Phillips is not a postmodernist or a critical theorist. Vera Baird is not a postmodernist or critical theorist. You're not going to find any of these people writing great profound pieces of work on Jacques Derrida, or on Deleuze, or on Baudrillard, or explaining their thoughts on Habermas, or the dialectic of enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, or any of those things. They're not critical theorists, they're not postmodernists. Those claims are all just conspiracy theories, and they have no basis in empirical fact or the history of ideas. I'm also not going to discuss blank slatism, although blank slatism does play a role in that aforementioned internecine debate between Radfems and intersectionals. Intersectionals tend to be more attracted to blank slatism, or some version of blank slatism, whereas Radfems are opponents of blank slatism. But the emphasis on the attempt to emphasize the great sin that is blank slatism is essentially a propaganda trick. If you read, for example, Cordelia Fine's work, like Testosterone Rex and others, Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine, Cordelia Fine is not a blank slater. She's simply somebody who attributes very low level of causal significance to the underlying innate biological differences between males and females. She believes that the majority of outcome differences are actually caused, at least statistically, are culturally, are the results of cultural conditioning. So she's about 10%, she's about 90% blank slater, or 80% blank slater. And then you can go up that scale, but nobody really is a 0% person. Nobody's a 100% blank slater. They don't exist. It's all essentially a propaganda trick. This, by the way, isn't to say that Cordelia Fine is right. In fact, I tend to think that she's wrong, and that sex differences are not 10%, they're more like 50%. But where one is located on that scale is not a matter of any great significance at all in the grand scheme of things. The feminists who erected the whole educational legal framework of treating men as second-class citizens were largely Radfems, not the intersectionals. And Radfems are opponents, of course, of blank slatism. They're biological essentialists, and they consider men to be biologically inferior. Germaine Greer is absolutely crystal clear in her writings that men are to be considered inferior versions of women. So that's the one aspect of that internecine debate between Radfems and intersectionals, but I'm actually going to ignore it for the most part. Finally, I'm just going to discuss this the language that is used in contemporary feminism, to the jargon and language and terminology that is used for them to explain the phenomena that they consider to exist. It's a cult, and every cult develops its own mumbo-jumbo jargon, and here is the mumbo-jumbo jargon that one will see. If one reads contemporary feminist agitation and propaganda. So male violence, of course, there's no recognition that females engage in violence as well. Safe space is a concept invented and developed by feminists throughout the 70s and 80s, and now widely implemented. Patriarchy, misogyny, male privilege, toxic masculinity, rape culture, rape myth, vulnerable, trauma, incel, porn addict, underrepresentation, implicit bias, stereotype threat, gender diversity, marginalization, subjugation, domination, silencing, erasure, gender norms, mansplaining, and male fragility. These are just some examples of the mumbo-jumbo jargon. This is not scientific jargon at all. This is not akin to angular momentum or torque or kinetic energy or the polarization of the electromagnetic or an electromagnetic wave. These are not technical terms from scientific endeavor. These are mumbo jumbo notions from a cult. In the remainder of the talk, I will go through the 4 points that I listed at the outset, and I'll do that next. I next attempt to make good the promises that I made at the start to explain why feminism is not progressive, it's not egalitarian, it's not liberal, it's not left-wing. Begin with feminism not being progressive. We see examples of misandry and hate. These expressions of misandry and hate are made by professional journalists, made by professional academics. They're made in newspapers and in magazines with a gigantic platform. These are not claims that are being made by teenagers with 12 followers on Twitter. These have been made by very well-known individuals, Julie Bindlow, for example, Suzanne Moore, many others, The Washington Post, New Statesman, The Guardian, Why I Hate Men. You can't hate them all, can you? Actually, I can. And many, many, many other examples of misandry and hate routinely expressed. That's misandry and hate expressed towards men, not expressed towards any other group, which would lead, obviously, to a ban of some kind or punishment. But the expression of hatred, sometimes murderous hatred, in fact, towards men goes with almost no protest at all. We have sexist discrimination against men, sexist discrimination against boys in the education system, and sexist discrimination against men in the higher education system, and sexist discrimination against men in the legal system, in the family courts, in the criminal justice system, and in the incarceration system. Very high levels of discrimination against men, and such things generate no protest whatsoever, and they're very clearly not progressive. We have the suppression of science. Science is something that a progressive would normally claim to hold in high esteem, but when science says something which contradicts the feminist narrative, then it's suppressed. 2 examples of that are domestic violence science, science surrounding domestic violence, established science surrounding domestic violence, the primary finding of which 5 decades, in fact, 4 decades ago, this has been established. Primary finding is that males and females are about as prone to engage and perpetrate domestic violence as the other way around. Men perpetrate about as much as women do. Women perpetrate about as much as men do. This is called gender symmetry. It's a more or less established fact amongst scientists researching on this topic. That's suppressed. That is not progressive. The suppression of science is not progressive. Likewise, we have the suppression of science in relation to the so-called gender pay gap. The gender pay gap is a measure of aggregate average earnings by men compared to average aggregate earnings by women. And there's the difference. Men earn more on average than women do on average, but this does not refer to individual jobs. It does not imply that men earn more on the same job as women earn on the same job. The explanation for the difference, which is a scientific explanation, which has also been repeatedly confirmed by labor economists, is that men and women have different occupations, different choices in lifestyle. They have different patterns of work. Women tend to prefer part-time work, men, and to spending time with their family. And as soon as one disaggregates these data, the gender pay gap disappears. There's no evidence for a discriminatory effect. The evidence is simply not there. That science is, of course, suppressed, and governments enforce companies to engage in gender pay gap reporting, but it's contradicted by the science. None of that is progressive. It's anti-progressive. We have the doctrine of the patriarchy, which is a central component of feminist identity politics, which part of their oppression narrative. That's a conspiracy theory. We do not live in a patriarchy. There are many leaders, or the leader of the country where I'm actually sitting right now is a woman, Nicola Sturgeon. The leader of West Germany, Chancellor for the last 15 years, is Angela Merkel, a woman. The Vice Chancellor of Oxford University is a woman. The head of the Metropolitan Police, Cressida Dick, is a woman. One can give countless examples. We do not live in a patriarchal system. A patriarchal system is sometimes defined as a system in which men exercise power over women. Well, that would be a rather peculiar conclusion to draw from the fact that the leader of Germany for the last 15 years has been Angela Merkel, or that the most powerful policing figure in one of the largest cities in the world, London, is also a woman, and that the head of one of the most prestigious universities in the world is also a woman. The claim that we live in a patriarchy is a conspiracy theory. It's not supported by any evidence. It's a conspiracy theory. Finally, gynocentrism. Gynocentrism is a tendency amongst humans to give women greater protection and to give men less of protection, to treat men as inherently harmful and to treat women as inherently harmless. That's gynocentrism. Now, gynocentrism is simply an empirical fact about human cognition and human behavior. In itself, it's neither progressive nor regressive, but using progressive prejudices in order to buttress a political ideology is transparently regressive, not progressive. Likewise, belief in conspiracy theories is not progressive, it's regressive. Turning next to the point about egalitarianism, the definitions given at the beginning, frequently, three of them out of four, adverted to feminism involving a belief in gender equality or equality of the sexes. The empirical fact is that feminism is anti-egalitarian. We have a privileged group. Women are treated as a privileged caste. In effect, they are not assigned the same responsibilities in the legal system as men are. And one can give lots of examples. Well, privilege really means to be immune from certain legal obligations. That literally applies to women. We have correspondingly, we have the disposability of men. A nice example of that is not so much nice; it's actually a horrible example of the disposability of men is the behavior of Boko Haram, the Islamist group in Nigeria, who kidnapped about 10,000 boys, subjected them to horrible treatment, burned some of them alive, and nobody paid any attention. Because nobody paid any attention, Boko Haram then went on to kidnap about 300 girls. This brought about international outrage. What this shows is that men are vastly more disposable than women are. Likewise, we have the denial of due process. This is not an egalitarian position at all. It's clear that the denial of due process, given the massive asymmetry in conviction and incarceration, will gigantically adversely affect men. And furthermore, the denial of due process is almost always in relation to sex-related crimes. And what that means is that when you eliminate or undermine or severely restrict due process, then you're engaging in anti-egalitarian activism and policymaking. Again, we have the excuse-making and downplaying of female-perpetrated violence. This is an anti-egalitarian position. It's obviously not egalitarian. The science on this matter is reasonably clear, and yet female-perpetrated violence is downplayed, and male-perpetrated domestic violence is significantly emphasized and overplayed. I next go through some examples of anti-egalitarianism by highlighting some gender gaps. I don't wish to make the same mistake that feminists do, which is to draw the automatic conclusion that a gender gap implies a discriminatory effect. Feminists frequently do make this inference, but they don't substantiate the particular conclusion. They simply point to the gap. The gap itself does not necessarily indicate a discriminatory effect. But nonetheless, one could argue that the gender gap involved it does exist, and that if one were an egalitarian, one would take steps to remedy that particular gap. So here are some examples of gaps. There's a gigantic domestic violence funding gap. Essentially, all the funding in domestic violence goes to women, over 99%, despite the the science of this matter, which establishes that men and women are about equally likely to be victimized by domestic violence and equally likely to be perpetrators. Despite that fact, the government funding is given largely to women and to women's groups and organizations with a feminist agenda, and that funding is not given to men. In fact, in relation to men, it's downplayed. The gap is, in fact, gigantic. It's essentially a 99% gap. It's a huge gap, gigantic gap. Incarceration, about 95% of those incarcerated are men. The men are about 20 times more likely to be incarcerated than women are in the UK, and there are similar figures in other countries. The UK is actually rather extreme on this matter. That's a gigantic gap. That's a 90% gender gap. It's simply a gap, and one cannot deny the existence of that gap. One can perhaps try and account for it in various ways, but the gap is gigantic. It's about 90%. There's a sentencing gap, which is well known to criminologists and established by multiple studies. Men are more likely to be charged, more likely to be prosecuted, more likely to be convicted than women are for the same crime as well, and to receive much lengthier sentences. Men are the vast majority of the homeless, 80 to 90%, about 88% in the last time I looked. And the UK government's figures, there's a gigantic gap there. Again, it's about an 80% gender gap in homelessness. Suicide, men are about 75% of suicides, women about 25%. Sometimes it's 80 to 20. So we have a gender gap of about 50 to 60% when it comes to suicide. That's a real gender gap in relation to suicide. In the teaching profession, there's a gigantic gender gap between men and women in terms of who are teachers. It's particularly extreme at the level of nursery school and primary school, but it continues right the way through secondary school. There's a gigantic gender gap. Men are far less likely to be involved in the teaching profession than women are. School leaver outcomes, very similar gender gap. Girls, in this case, have much better outcomes, much better results for their GCSEs and A-levels. This has been the case since the mid-90s. It's a widespread phenomenon. There's a significant gap. There's a similar gap in relation to school exclusions. School exclusions are almost always boys. There's a gigantic gap there, and that's because the environment of the modern primary school and secondary school has been largely geared up for the interests of girls and not boys. In higher education, we have a gender gap of roughly 57% to 43%, averaged over the OECD. This is not a localized phenomenon, and it's not a recent phenomenon as well. It goes back to the 1980s and the 1990s. Pretty much every college, every university has a majority of women. On average, it's about 57 to 43% men. It's sometimes much higher than that, a gap of about 14% on average. And we have a life expectancy gap as well of about 3 years. Women live about 3 years longer than men do. Now, these are all perfectly real gender gaps, and no doubt one can cite even more gender gaps if one looks more carefully. Feminists do not, there are no feminists advocating equalization of incarceration numbers with men and women, no feminists advocating fairer sentencing. There are no feminists advocating special provisions for male homelessness or male suicide. Feminists don't care about equality. It's not an egalitarian position at all. I next turn to the question of whether feminism is liberal and whether feminism is left-wing. Feminism is neither liberal nor is it left-wing. Feminists advocate infantilism. Infantilism involves treating women as children, as infants, treating grown adults as infants is not liberal. Liberalism involves a number of components as the political view developed in the late 17th century under the Whigs onwards, and one component was treating adults as individuals who are moral agents and have individual responsibilities as well as rights, and treating women as infants is illiberal. Several components of liberalism are directly attacked by feminism. These include free speech, they include due process, and they include the expansion of state and institutional power to control and regulate people's lives. They involve intolerance, which is directly contradictory to liberalism, so undermining due process is completely clear. Feminists have introduced and implemented a whole range of changes, legal changes, which have undermined due process, and these are a direct attack on liberalism, because liberalism has been based for hundreds of years on presumptions of innocence and due process. Feminists have notoriously suppressed free speech. There's a variety of things that feminists don't want people to do, kind of Puritan reasons or moralistic reasons. These are suppressions of free speech. Feminists frequently play the misogyny card or play the woman card and claim that they are being subjected to some or another form of sexist oppression and use that to suppress free speech. That's clearly illiberal. Feminists have expanded state and institutional power, expanded police power, expanded human resources power, expanded a whole variety of measures which essentially target men. These are not liberal positions in the slightest. They're completely, fundamentally illiberal positions. Feminists have promoted extreme moralism in relation to, for example, sex work. Sex work is considered to be a form of oppression by the patriarchy, and they've attempted to prevent women making individual choices in relation to engaging in sex work, which is clearly something that women have something of an advantage over in relation to men of a similar age. And feminists have attempted to block and prevent that from happening. That's moralism. The same thing with sexual interactions between men, women. Feminists have tried to control and regulate those private interactions between men and women, which is none of their business. Simply not their business. It's not the business of feminists. It's not the business of Christian Puritans. It's not the business of Islamic zealots to control individual people's lives and relationships and interactions. It's simply not their business. It's none of their business. Liberalism says that people should be free to decide how to live their life, how to what decisions to make in their life. That's liberalism. Feminism is opposed to all of this. Feminists have used mobbing and vigilante methods, which are clearly inconsistent with liberalism. Liberalism is predicated, as I've said before, on due process and on freedom and on tolerance. The use of mobbing techniques and vigilante methods, cancellation and ostracism, these are techniques which are fundamentally illiberal. They violate the basic principles and norms of a tolerant society, a liberal society, a free society. These are fundamentally illiberal practices. And in relation to what I've said before, we have this growth in authoritarian control, authoritarian regulation, the power of the government to control and regulate its population, the power of institutions to control and regulate its employees, the power of corporations to do the same thing. And what is demanded is authoritarian control and obedience, and if one is engaged in any kind of disobedience, then one will be punished. These are straightforward examples of illiberalism. Finally, I'll turn to the slightly more vexed question of whether feminism is a left-wing position as opposed to a right-wing position. So the left and the right are usually characterized in economic terms. So the economic left is high tax, high spending, large welfare states, and the economic right is usually associated with libertarian policies of reductions in tax and greater individual economic freedom. Now, in what sense is feminism a left-wing position on that categorization? So on one end you have socialists and Marxists, and on the other end you have libertarians like Nozick and Rothbard and others. There doesn't seem to be any sense in which a gender-based system of discrimination and hatred is a left-wing position. The only real phenomenon in which one might think that feminism is somehow left-wing, as opposed to a historical reason. The historical reason is that some of the early activists in the late 60s and early 70s were most certainly Marxists, and they attempted to combine their critique of patriarchal oppression with their critique of capitalist oppression. And one will find a number of writers from the early 70s writing in this way and trying to combine these things. And to some extent, Catherine McKinnon, for example, does this. Those sorts of positions have largely died out nowadays. It wouldn't be correct to associate those sorts of positions with contemporary feminism. What one does see, however, is something that is sometimes called the apex fallacy. The apex fallacy refers to the fact that if you look at the top of society, you may see a certain distribution in relation to gender, but that doesn't automatically, that small sample, it might be 1%, it might be less than 1%, does not reflect the other 99%. And if one looks at the rest of the shape of these layers of economic well-being or socio-economic well-being, one sees a very, very, very different distribution. So one looks at chief executive officers, one looks at successful STEM professionals, and one looks at the employees engaged in programming and in tech companies. One sees men, there are far more men there than there are women. One sees the CEOs of the large tech companies and the like, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk are mostly men. That is true, but that ignores the 99% beneath them. And when one looks at the other layers, one sees men increasingly filling the layers as one goes down. And when one gets to the bottom, one finds all of those bottom layers filled with men: incarceration, homeless, unemployed, and so on and so on and so forth. So that's the apex fallacy. Now, if feminism were left-wing, it would be concerned about the people at the bottom, not simply the distribution at the top. Just the conflict with distribution at the top could only be explained by some kind of envy amongst people in that tiny proportion of the population, amongst the elite, essentially rich white women competing with rich white men. At the bottom of society, you have a gigantic number of men, white men and black men, filling the prisons and the homeless, and so on and so on and so forth. So this is not a left-wing position at all. One would expect, if feminists were left-wing, to be concerned about the working class and the values and beliefs of the working class, but it's perfectly obvious that feminists have no interest in the working class, who they rather famously denounce as deplorables, which pretty much summarizes the attitude of contemporary feminism to the working classes. I can't see any reasonable sense in which feminism is a left-wing view, and it should also be pointed out that probably the most influential feminist in British politics in the last 5 years has been Theresa May. Theresa May was a conservative. She was the Prime Minister from 2015 to 2019, and she very famously held highly feminist views, promoted the gender pay gap. You see pictures of her with a "This is what a feminist looks like" T-shirt. She was a conservative, and one can see that exactly the same phenomenon in conservative parties throughout the world. Conservative policies, policies that promote feminist ideas, are very closely connected to feminism in general. This is not a left-wing position in the slightest. It is completely compatible with, and in fact endorsed by, a great many conservatives. And as people have pointed out, a great deal of contemporary feminist puritanism is an echo of Mary Whitehouse's moralistic puritanism from the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. So this is not a left-wing position at all, in the slightest. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I have said what feminism is not. Feminism is not progressive. It's not egalitarian. It's not liberal, and it's not left-wing either.